Today we have top 4 competitor at SCG Philly, Amy Altman.
Next on Eternal Durdles.
Hey, I just want to give a quick shout out to all of our Patreon supporters out there. Thank you to the Durdle Maniacs. If you want to be a Durdle Maniac, go to patreon.com/eternaldurdles and help support the channel. It keeps things going. It keeps things updated. Thanks so much for watching. On with the show. Hello and welcome to Eternal Durdles. I'm your host, Zach Clark, and with me this week, Amy Altman, top 4 from SCG Philly on, what are we calling this deck? I've been calling it Draco Pact, but I think there's probably a better name. What are we calling this deck?
I've just been calling it 5-color Beanstalk. I think it's mostly similar to the 5-color Beanstalks. It's decks that have been played previously. Something involving the word Leyline is probably a pretty good thing, given the 8 Leylines in my deck.
Yeah, oh god, 8 Leylines?
Well,
Leyline binding, I guess. Yeah. I guess, Leyline beans, right? I think the big difference between this deck and, say, your average Eternal Weekend Beans deck is the Leyline and the Guildpact Draco combination that you have.
Yeah, that's the big difference. I actually considered playing Draco in some other decks previously, and so when I saw this deck from Jarvis, I was just super excited because it was a card. Draco was a card that I've played a bunch in Modern, and I thought about a lot, and just adding that shell and giving yourself the flexibility of that, and the sort of gets you some free wins has been really cool.
Yeah, I play. I don't play Modern much, but I have one Modern deck built because, look, man, Tarmogoyfs, man. I just wanted to play with my Tarmogoyfs, and I can't do that in Legacy anymore, So yeah. I was playing Zoo in Modern, but I'm sure so much has changed since. I'm sure that they're probably playing Guildpact too in Modern with Draco. The power level of that card rises so much with Leyline of the Guildpact. Yeah,
Draco was a powerful card, especially if you can get the right colors of your creatures, so you can get the powerful abilities. But it's really good when it always comes down on turn 2 and always gives you all the abilities.
Yeah, that is wild. So let's talk about some other choices you made with the deck. So obviously your creature suite is 4 Draco, 3 Solitude, 3 Catherine, 3 Triumph of St. Catherine, and 1 Murktide Regent. Did you play with those numbers at all, or is that the stock list?
No, this is the list I found from Jarvis. I really liked the I really liked the list, the numbers from Jarvis. I'd been playing Solitude in my sort of more control-y 5-color Beanstalks list, like the list I got min-cashed EW with. Mm-hmm. And so when I saw that in the list, it was really appealing to me. And having the extra, the blue creature to go with the Scion of Draco when you don't have Leyline seemed really good, and just having ways to close out the game, which was one of the big problems I had with that deck that I played at EW.
Yeah, and I think there's a theme running with this deck is that you have the correct amount of blue cards and white cards to make your pitch spells work properly. I think, obviously having Guildpact as a all pitch spell kind of card is there to make it work. But, playing 3 Triumph of St. Catherine along with the 3 Solitude, and then having just a massive amount of blue cards allows you to basically always be able to pitch something.
Yeah, I think a huge part of the power of Leyline of the Guildpact is the fact that it pitches to all of the pitch spells, and it's also a card you're never going to cast out of your hand. Well, I cast it once in the tournament, but almost never going to. It immediately won me the game in which I cast it, but but it's just a card that sits in your hand. And then because it's so much better than in Modern, because you have Brainstorm to put it away and Ponder to put it 3 cards down and hopefully shuffle it before you draw it. So you have much more ways to deal with drawing this dead card in the late game. And it's just often not dead. It was often the number 1 card I wanted to draw because I wanted a pitch for my Solitude and my Force Will.
Yeah. So spoiler alert, we played in the second round. After you took your only loss on the day until your final round on the day, which is I was 0-1, so I was not walking into this tournament in round 2 thinking I was going to play anyone who was going to be in the top 8 at the very least. I was here we go, this is my day. So I'm glad I didn't ruin your breakers. It looks like you got in at 21 points and the cutoff was 20, so I didn't even have anything to do with your breakers, which is good.
Yeah, my breakers were pretty terrible, but X1 should make the top 8 of any Swiss tournament. So I had to win all my rounds, and I did that.
It turns out if you just decide to win all your rounds, you can get there.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about a couple of the cards in the sideboard here because you were we did an analysis of the total number of Murders of Carlisle Manors cards, and you were 1/4 of those cards in the top 8 with clocking in with 3 cards. You had the hedge maze, which we saw a lot of the lands, but you were playing 2 Doorkeeper Thrall in your sideboard. How good was Doorkeeper Thrall?
Doorkeeper Thrall was awesome. It pretty much single-handedly won me my quarterfinals match, and it was also good. I brought it in. I played against Goblins, and I played against brought it against Cephalid Breakfast for their Stone Forges and their Thassa's Oracles. It was just a really good card all day. The stopping dice triggers didn't really come up that much, but I'm sure there's
chef's
some
kiss
situations
to just stopping name goblin with flash, just like sticker name goblin. You're like, absolutely not.
Yeah. I didn't actually. The craziest thing was, even though it was flash, I don't think I actually got a blowout where somebody cast a ETB creature and I flashed it in response. I just was able to play it on their end step in turn 2, untap, continue to have my mana up, and then it just changed all their plays. I didn't really need to hold it up and respond. It was just, and I just got in there, attacked for 1 or 2, made my opponent answer it before they could deploy their powerful creature. And that worked out really well. It was just, it kind of felt like the perfect thing. It was also, there were several situations under which it was protected by the Leyline Scion combination.
Yeah.
And against situations where my opponent could have beaten the Leyline Scion combination, but they couldn't also remove the Leyline and then the Doorkeeper Thrall and then also kill me. So it was really good. I'm really happy I played the card, and I think it messed up some weird things. It messed up Ryan Burnt Taco, my quarterfinals opponent. He had Cryptic Coat in his sideboard and sided it in against me.
Ooh.
To try to get around my Containment Priest and my Cage and my Endurance and whatever. And it shuts off Cryptic Coat. And there's just some other things that it does that are really awesome. I think it also interacts very well with if Kappa Cannoneer is still in the format. It shuts off things triggering Kappa Cannoneer, which is really cool. So it just came up a lot, and it was something that felt really good just to throw out there as soon as I could cast it and just keep my mana up. Yeah,
Kappa Cannoneer just being a 4/4 for 6 mana seems like it's not really worth the cost at that point.
Yeah, not as much 8 cast going on right now, but I'm sure I would be very happy to have it in that matchup.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk about your round. You started off playing against Mono Black Reanimator.
Yeah, it was the deck that has a little bit of red for Fable and maybe some sideboard cards, but the Saga Reanimator deck. And I got very fast Atraxid with several Thoughtseizes and several Dark Rituals. And I actually almost won that game, which was kind of crazy because I was really looking going into the tournament to not play against Reanimator decks. I felt like the Grief Reanimator decks were just the best positioned against my deck because they do powerful things very quickly, and I'm just trying to be reactive, and the Grief plan is so good against me being reactive. The Grief into something powerful is so good against that. But I was feeling, even though I lost that game where my opponent put Thoughtseize me 3 times and put Atrax into play on turn 2, I was feeling really good because I was like, wow, I could actually come close to winning this game. And it came down to Force of Will costing costing life to pitch. I would have countered my opponent's last spell and I was at 1. And so I would have, it was just, but I wasn't even discouraged at that point because I was just like, wow, I can't believe I was in this game. This deck feels really good. And just felt like I really had an opportunity to be in that game. And I ended up losing game 2 to, I think pretty much the same thing. I don't remember exactly, but honestly, I was kind of coming in expecting to play against Reanimator and not do so well against it. So it was kind of the thing I was most concerned about. But I didn't lose again, I guess, until the semis.
Eternal Dirtles is proud to be sponsored by Moxfield. Moxfield is the best Magic the Gathering deck building website on the internet. You can create, share, and find decks from Commander to Legacy, and even fan-supported formats like Pre-Modern and Old School. You can see all of our decks on our Moxfield. Follow the links below to stay tuned. So I have a rare opportunity here because normally people hear about my matches from me, but this is a rare opportunity where we get to hear about one of my matches through the person who I played against. And go off, like what I want to hear, like unfiltered opinion about this match. So I won't interrupt you at all on this.
It really sucks for you that you queued into my deck. I'm going to be honest. I think almost everything I'm doing in my deck is like very good against your deck. I have a lot of removal spells. I have a lot of cheap, flexible removal spells. I have the Leyline Scion thing, which is just like all I want to do against your deck is like have a couple removal spells and also present some blockers. And just everything in my deck is going towards that. So that it's kind of bad luck for you, honestly. Like I was just, when I put Leon and Sign into play, I'm just like, I always just want to have any flying blocker of any kind against Infect, just to force them to cast their spells. Like force them to cast their spells first, and then I respond. And just my deck was set up so well for that. And I even had, obviously I wasn't really thinking about Infect, and Jarvis, when he built the deck, wasn't really thinking about Infect, but I had plenty of cards to bring in, and the Kozilek's returns in my sideboard were also really good. They didn't really come up, but I'm sure that there were some situations they would be really good, especially because your big protection thing right now is the Legolas's quick reflexes.
Yeah, being that it was only relevant like one or two times against you, and both times you had Leyline out and all your creatures had hexproof, so it didn't really matter. I actually played into that, completely forgot about it. I think the hardest part for me is that normally against the Leyline decks, I'm set up to be able to beat them with an Inkmoth Nexus. Because Leyline binding doesn't really matter to me. And that just wasn't the case here. Also, vigilance is an issue, but the fact that you can actually start attacking me and put a clock on me is a big deal as well.
Yeah, that is honestly the biggest thing. Just if you compare this to the Bowmasters, Fourth Aerlingus, sort of 5-color Beans decks that people have been playing, including the list I played at EW, this deck actually can close the game. And like Fourth Aerlingus closes the game, but it's kind of slow, and a lot of times it's very risky to like run it out early and stuff like that. But this deck just actually closes the game, which just eliminates a huge problem it had with fast, resilient combo decks, in that I can have the Force of Will and I can have the key piece of interaction on early turns, but I'm going to give you 4 or 5 more turns to find more ways to kill me, because I'm going to take at least 4 or 5 more turns to kill you. And this deck just a lot of the times can just play out a 4/4 flyer, start presenting a clock, start presenting something you have to deal with. And that's just a really huge thing. And I don't really have to worry about win conditions. And it was just a huge thing that it provided blockers. It dealt with wide boards pretty well, which is a thing that the deck had previously, because you weren't really playing sweepers in the deck. It was kind of a thing if you got your opponent had a wide board against Cradle or against Initiative. It just does a really good job because your opponent can't attack around the flying creature.
Pivotal play in this match was probably my final like hurrah, attacking with Glistener Elf into 2 of your Scion of Dracos.
Yeah, I didn't tell you this after the match, but I actually had Kozilek's Return in hand to put 2 damage on your 10/10 if you had like Veil of Summer for my Force of Will. And so your creature would have died to first strike damage.
Yeah, and the only card I had to react. So the play was I attacked, you double blocked, I invigorated. You're like, okay. I invigorated again, and you Force of Will. The only card left in my hand is Legolas's Quick Reflexes. So that would have Kozilek's Return on top of the Force of Will. Anyhow, you had two answers for me.
Yeah, I just, for the longest time, like when I first started playing Modern years ago, Infect with Gitaxian Probe was the best deck. And the number one thing I learned at that time that I still keep in my head every time I play against Infect in every format is just always block.
Yeah.
Just always block. Make your opponent cast a spell first, and I think that just like is like a huge thing. Just run the blocks out there, and if you use 3 spells to kill my Scions, like you have like Invigorate, Veil, or whatever, I didn't die. Like
Yeah,
that's pretty
exactly,
important.
yeah.
You know, like I live to play the next game or whatever, and I can't like be afraid. I'm just gonna slam block as fast as possible as soon as I can every time.
My hope was to buy a couple of turns and maybe draw into it. Like I think I had you at like maybe 8 infect. I don't know.
Yeah, you had 6 or 8.
6. Yeah, I had enough that like one pump spell would have got you if I had gotten there. But I was just trying to like, okay, if I can stabilize here, maybe I can like, whoops, I drew a spell and we're just like going card for card, which is tough against a Beanstalk deck. But it didn't seem like, I think you sided out Beanstalks, I'm assuming, against me.
I definitely trimmed a couple.
Yeah.
I think I trimmed, if I remember correctly, I trimmed the couple Beanstalks and a couple the Triumphs of St. Catherine's. Yeah. The ground blocker didn't really seem that good to me.
Yeah, it's only dealing with Glister Elf, which seemed like the only thing I got against you anyhow. But
yeah, you had some of the Blighted Agents, and that's how you do it the first 6 infect.
Oh yeah, that actually makes sense.
In game 2, but I just have a lot of removal in my deck, and I also sided in Force of Vigor against you because I was particularly concerned about Inkmoth Nexus because of my inability to interact with it with Leyline Binding.
All right, so let's go on to Mono Red Prison in round 3.
So Mono Red Prison in round 3, I actually knew what my opponent was on beforehand because somebody I knew had played against her earlier in the day, but I don't really think it impacted my decisions at all. I had Leyline Scion. I think I won the die roll and had Leyline Scion in game 1. In game 2, I had Leyline, but I think I had to pitch. I didn't have the Scion. I just had some removal, and I think I had to Force of Will something, and then I had to pitch a Solitude on something, and I just like fell too far behind with all my pitch spells, and kind of she just had a resilient draw with the right amount of mana and the right amount of threats, and I got run over pretty quickly by Caves of Chaos Adventurer. And then in game 3, I had Leyline Scion again. And it's also so the way the Blood Moon Leyline of the Guildpact interaction works is that the Blood Moon's almost always going to come down after the Leyline, because the Leyline is almost definitely being put in on turn 0. Yeah. But so it turns all your lands, it turns off all your non-basics, turns them into mountains because of the way that the rules work. But your basics are 5-color basics. So even though I was very careful to like fetch instead of just tapping my fetch lands, which I can do for mana, I was like fetching my basics. And so even if my opponent landed the Blood Moon, which I think they still like is really good against me, and it's really good against me if I don't have Leyline, and still okay against me if I do have Leyline. But I was able to like fetch out my basics, kind of play around Blood Moon, not have to be super concerned about the Blood Moon because I still had access to my Scion and my Leyline Binding with the basics being 5-color lands, because Blood Moon just doesn't affect basics at all. Yeah,
I guess that actually is pretty interesting because I was thinking for myself, this was a card before I realized that the layers would work the way they were. I was like, oh, this could answer Blood Moon for me, but I just like kind of threw it out the window. But for you, it actually does kind of still answer Blood Moon because so much of your deck deals with having access to 5 colors with what is that effect called? I forget.
Domain.
Domain, yeah. So having domain for your Leyline and for Draco. So it actually still works out for you, even if they throw a Blood Moon, as long as you're being careful.
Yeah, Blood Moon is a huge weakness for these 5-color Beans decks, and getting something that helps you a little bit against it. And I think I felt like if I got to fetch 2 basics, if I didn't face like the turn 1 like Blood Moon or whatever, I felt really good about my ability to not really care too much about Blood Moon. Obviously, the turn 1 Blood Moon is just going to be really good unless you like happen to draw your basics, even against the Leyline of the Guildpact. I had like the Kozilek's returns in and stuff like that, so I could deal with Maguses, and I had Force of Vigor in to deal with Blood Moon and some other things. So I had like outs to a turn 1 Blood Moon, but I would have been pretty unhappy and fallen pretty far behind if something like that. I think the her turn 1 play in game 3 was Trinisphere, and I had the Force Negation for it,
nice.
Which was really big because I was intending to cast a lot of like 1 mana Leyline Bindings and 2 mana Scions and stuff like that.
All right, so round 4, you go to face friend of the show Devin Riley on Cephalid Breakfast.
Yeah, so game 1, I have Leyline Scion and like a couple of removal spells. I have a Leyline Binding, and I fetch on my end step and get Hedge Maze. The only reasons I ever fetch when I have Leyline, turn 0 Leyline, are to get Hedge Maze or to get basics. And my opponent led on Saga on turn 1. So I was totally fine to, like, I wasn't going to get Wastelanded. So I went and got my Hedge Maze, left a second Leyline Binding on top, and then my opponent just plays a Delta and passes. And I screwed up here. I should have left up double Leyline Binding, because the coolest thing ever is like you get to do 2 Leyline Bindings on turn 2 with Leyline and Guildpact. It's just so much less clunky in that way. And I should have just not played Scion on 2. I didn't know what my opponent was on, but I just died.
Yeah,
my opponent. I'm pretty sure I would have actually survived because I had 2 Leyline Bindings. My opponent had a kill on turn 3 with Force of Will backup because they played the Saga on turn 1. And I was like, okay, cool. I finally lost a game, because up until that point, I had won every game where I had Leyline Scion, and I had lost every game when I didn't have that. So I was like, okay, maybe this is the only way the deck can win games. Yeah. But I lost a game where I had Leyline Scion to my opponent's turn 3 combo. And then the post-board games, I had a lot of sideboard cards. The Graveyard Hate's relevant. The Spell Hate's relevant. The Doorkeeper Thrall's irrelevant. It really felt like I was in pretty good shape. I didn't really need as much of my win conditions. Like the Triumph of St. Catherine's just not really about, like, they can kind of beat me down with constructs, and they kind of almost beat me down with constructs in one of the games. But I was able to just control the game, set up my beanstalks, and have just a grip full of answers. But that deck is so good. Like, I'm constantly impressed by good Cephalid Breakfast pilots' ability to, like, present kill after kill. Yeah. Like, they're just like, I'm going to cast a fairy, and if this resolves, you're dead. And then I'm going to cast Silence, and if this resolves, you're dead. And then I'm going to cast Cephalid Illusionist with Force of Will backup, and if this resolves, you're dead. And it just, like, kept happening, and I just, like, kept finding the right combinations of, like, Force of Vigors and Force of Wills and Leyline Bindings to be able to keep my opponent off the kill. In game 3, I had a lot more of I had the Containment Priest and the Cage, and I think my opponent actually was able to draw the Oracle, which is, like, really good for them, because then they don't have to reanimate it. But I think I was able to deal with enough of their combo pieces and get that. And just having, mostly I sided out the Triumphs and the Murktides, because they're just, like, slow and they don't come down fast enough, and they're somewhat difficult to set up. And I just, like, was dependent on killing my opponent with Scions, and I found the Scions and was able to, like, present a clock that I don't think I had the ley lines, but just present a clock that actually ended the game fast, because that's a huge problem against Cephalid Breakfast. Is their deck is so good at drawing redundant pieces, and with the sagas and the and stuff like that.
I was just thinking while you were talking about, like, not having the binding, is that what the Triome is for those situations where you don't have the binding, so you can just be like, okay, well, I have 3 colors in this one land.
Yeah. The Triome is pretty good. You can't always depend on having on binding, and just if you ever put yourself in a situation like where you can't cast binding for 1 mana on turn 2 just to play around days and stuff like that, you're obviously playing into Wasteland if you do that. But the Triome was pretty good. I've been playing Triomes for a while in Legacy, because I was playing them in the 5-color beans deck for a couple months, and it hasn't come up that much. It came up actually in one of my semifinals matches, where I just, like, drew the Triome and I needed any untapped land or any, like, and it was just really bad that it was a tapped land. But that's going to, like, happen sometimes if you're playing Mystic Sanctuary or the new Surveil lands that everybody's playing. And it's been really good. And it also is an extra source of red, because I, like, actually have it's not a red card, but I have a card that costs red mana in my sideboard. Doesn't get Hydroblasted. Very nice. Not that anybody should have that card in against me. But but I was able to. It's just an extra red source just in case your opponent is like super concerned or you get taken off red sources. It's just nice to have an extra one tossed in there because I actually have a red card in my deck.
All right. Well, now you're 3-1. You picked up a win against archetype veteran Devin on Cephalid Breakfast, and now you're going up against Edward Barton on Boros Painter.
So my opponent told me after game 1 that he fetched basic forest instead of plateau, and that probably lost him the match because I think he just died to, I forget, it was a Scion or a Triumph. I didn't have the Leyline, but I just like was able to clock him, and he just was never able to remove my threat. I think I used my Leyline bindings to go after some of the mana, some like the Goblin Shaman token, and maybe a Lotus Petal. And my opponent just kind of got stuck on lands. In game 2, I sort of ended up mana screwing my opponent again with a Force of Vigor on a Saga, and then my opponent really was never able to develop their mana. And I think that game I had Leyline on turn 0, but I didn't find a Scion for a couple turns. But once I was clocking my opponent with a Scion, it was really hard for them to come back because I've played a lot of, one of my friends is a very good, very experienced painter player, and I've played a ton of that matchup. And mostly they kill mostly they kill you with constructs.
Yeah.
Because it's so hard to go 1-for-1 against constructs. Even when you have your Beans engine going, even in all that thing, it's just so hard to find like enough removal spells to beat the constructs. And the fact that I just had this way to gain life, to present a good blocker if they're going to try and attack me back, just meant I couldn't really die to the constructs, which is like mostly the way I lose against that deck.
Yeah. Okay, so in the next round, there's no deck list for your opponent in the next round. There was apparently a paper deck list. What did you play?
A very traditional red-black reanimator list with the extra colors for like a couple sideboard cards, like usually Show and Tell and maybe Serenity, maybe Reverent Silence. I'm actually not sure which my opponent was on, but it is very relevant because those two cards are extremely good against my deck. My opponent's deck just didn't really function this round. They just like mulled to 5, and I had like reasonable hands. It was really good for me because, as I said, like Reanimator, and especially like the sort of older style Reanimator decks are like by far the decks I want to see the least because they just present putting a big, hard to deal with creature that gains a lot of value in and casting a lot of Thoughtseizes and Unmasks and Griefs early in the game. So the fact that my opponent like mulled to 5 twice and really didn't find a good combination of lands and spells was really great for me. But I had really good hands. Like I would have probably done okay against medium hands, but I'm just never ever beating the best hands out of Reanimator.
Yeah.
And so yeah, the game I mulled kind of low in game 2 to find a cage, and my opponent didn't have a discard spell on 1. I landed the cage and they never found an answer to it. So it felt kind of easy in hindsight, but that matchup is super concerning. And there's so many situations where you're just pretty much dead when your opponent griefs you on turn 1 because you kept one piece of interaction and your deck is never going to catch up to an Atraxa trigger.
Well, I say this every time I draw a Berserk. Better lucky than good.
Yeah.
All right, so we go up against Christopher on Mono Red Goblins. Man, you played a lot of prison decks over the weekend.
Yeah, I played very few blue decks. I guess I played blue decks. I played you. You were my only blue deck in Swiss. Oh, you and Cephalid Breakfast were my only blue decks in Swiss, but not really like normal like combo blue decks.
Yeah,
and then I played a bunch of people playing red and black cards. The Goblins matchup, I think, is one of the biggest reasons to play my deck. Having a ton of answers for Name Sticker, having good efficient removal for their like fast threats and stuff like that is really big. I just have an answer so I don't get tempoed out by Name Sticker. Hopefully your Force of Wills line up well against their Cavern of Souls, and you can just know you kind of got to throw your Force of Wills at their Chrome Moxes and against their other like lock pieces if they're playing any, because they're going to eventually draw Cavern of Souls and you're not going to be able to counter the Goblins. But Doorkeeper Thrall was awesome here. I mean, Jarvis like posted a recap that I ended up watching after the tournament. Probably should have watched it before the tournament, of his tournaments the previous weekend where he played this list, and he said he put the Doorkeeper Thralls in his sideboard because he knew few people at his 28-person event or whatever were going to be playing Goblins and D&T and stuff like that. So the cages, I just felt like I had a lot of good tools for the matchup, and I just have felt really good against that matchup. It's actually one of the biggest reasons for Solitude being in the deck and being so good, because it's just Creature Force of Will. I mean, Solitude is Creature Force of Will a lot of the time, but against Namesticker Goblin, it is a Creature Force of Will that beats Cavern of Souls, which is so huge. And it just gives you a lot of ways to stop their really busted draws, and then you can answer their Bombardiers and their Rabble Masters and stuff like that on their own. At the end of game 2, my opponent was able to like resolve I think I had to chump with a Doorkeeper Thrall to not die. And so I didn't have Doorkeeper Thrall, but my opponent had a Muxus in play and played a second Muxus, and they hit 2 creatures, but they were definitely combinations off the second Muxus. Like the first one got its trigger Doorkeeper Thralled, but off the second one, I could have lost the game if anything involving like Bombardiers or maybe even just a Rabble Master would have been enough. So it was a sweat, but I had like put myself in a really good position where my opponent had the Muxus, which was probably the only thing that killed me, and then they didn't hit what they needed off of it. But it felt really good, and I would have been very confident going into a game 3.
All right, then we go up against Jake and Romanowski on lands.
Yeah,
the last of the Swiss rounds.
Yeah, I got paired down, but we were both live for top 8 because some number of X1 and 1s would have made top 8. And so he would have made top 8 in my spot if he had beaten me, because there was one other X1 and 1 who made top 8. Although I don't know that was necessarily clear before the round, but we just sat down and played our match. And game 1, I got Leyline Scion and had a couple Leyline bindings for the Merit Lodges. He didn't have a really good mana engine, no exploration, no loam to keep hitting his land drops, so he was like kind of tight on mana and didn't have a good way to protect his Merit Lodges. He kind of got put under a fast clock because of the Scion, and that like really made him make Merit Lodge, I'm sure, much before he would do it. And I think this is another matchup where having that clock that starts on turn 2, whether or not it's protected by the Leyline or whatever, whether or not it's protected is just so huge, because previously there were so many things against lands where if they set up Wasteland, you were dead. If they set up a Merit Lodge with protection, you were dead. If they set up their Copy My Saga with Thespian Stage, you were largely dead to that. And just having this clock just meant my opponent couldn't go down any of those plans, and so it just made the matchup feel completely different. And that was a matchup with my previous lists and the list people have been playing a 5-color Beanstalk that it felt really really suspect. And that was one of the reasons I was still playing 4th Erlingus, because that was one of the few ways to ever beat lands.
And you have 11 ways to get rid of a 2020.
Yeah, I'm not like, super concerned about the 2020.
Yeah, it's not
except
a big deal.
if it comes with protection or it's like backed up by Sphere, so I can maybe only cast one removal spell. It's mostly about the Wastelands, the Loams and the Wastelands, and the Sagas and the Thespian Stages.
Yeah.
Like my opponent could have in game 2 gone for Saga Thespian Stage, but I was like, I think I had just played a Scion. I don't think I had protection for the Scion. That I didn't have the Leyline in game 2, but my opponent didn't have time to, because of the Scion, go for the Saga Thespian Stage thing, because it does take a couple turns to set up. And I was just able to kind of squeak it across the finish line, make them go for a Merit Lodge to block, and I had a Leyline binding. And that was actually the first time in one of those matches. It might have been, actually, it was that game 2. I did turn 0 Leyline in that game 2, but that was the first time one of my opponents had removed a Leyline of the Guildpact from the battlefield in the entire tournament up until that point, which was really huge.
Did you force a will mine? I know I targeted one at one point because I couldn't target your 2 Dracos. You
I might have
did.
forced. I think I did force a will it
because I was also hitting like something else. I was hitting a Leyline binding. So
Leyline binding.
Yeah, that's what it was.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, you were the only other time anybody even put a spell. I mean, I played against a lot of red black decks that just can't deal with it.
I was just like, I mean, I'd like to get rid of those Dracos, but I guess I'm just gonna get rid of this and maybe get a creature back. I was pretty much dead on board at that point, so I was just trying anything I could.
Yeah, I haven't really. It definitely is like good for your opponent to destroy it, especially if you're trying to do the Scion thing and they have more removal. But it's also the kind of thing where if my mana's developed okay at that point, I don't really care that much that my opponent destroyed it. They kind of have to destroy it, and then I don't really care when they do destroy it.
Yeah. All right, so going into the top 8, you're live for the top 8. You made it to the top 8. Ryan Mullins on Demiri Animator. You didn't want to see this.
I didn't want to see this, and I especially didn't want to see Ryan. He is an extremely good player. I think he got like top 32 at the last Pro Tour or whatever. He's somebody I have a lot of mutual friends with, have interacted with a couple times before. So it was a very fun, enjoyable, friendly match. Game 1, I got turn 2 Atraxid. Pretty much, I think my hand was probably a mulligan. In hindsight, I probably should have mulled like Scion, white removal spell, 4 lands.
What's going through your head when that Atraxa hits the board? Are you just like, well, I had a good run?
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of... I think my opponent had already griefed me once, and I was more like focusing on like, I should not have kept that hand. I should have at least picked a hand that would have like put up a fight against my opponent's deck or whatever. But I'm not actually 100% sure that hand was a mulligan. That's the thing about grief, and especially the decks that can scam it, is that you just can't mulligan looking for like particular answers, especially in game 1. And if my opponent had a slow hand that was based around like griefing me twice and then trying to set up like Bowmasters and stuff like that, my hand was pretty good against that because I had the Scion and the 2 removal spells. So I'm not exactly sure if it was a mulligan, but it definitely felt like a mulligan when my opponent had one of their better draws.
This episode is brought to you by Tales of Adventure. Go to toamagic.com and use the code DURTLES for 5% off your order. You'll be directly supporting the show, and you'll get the entire order in one package. No more waiting for several packages. That's toamagic.com, code DURTLES for 5% off.
So I lost game 1 against Ryan in the top 8, and I definitely felt like Jarvis had built a good sideboard for this matchup, so I had 8 or 9 cards to bring in, and game 2 was all about like hitting my land drops around Wasteland and Doorkeeper Thrall. My opponent, I played Doorkeeper Thrall when my opponent Wastelanded me on 2 and just attacked them with it. They waited a couple turns and then they decided that they just weren't drawing anything that beat Doorkeeper Thrall. And so they pitched 2 griefs to just put them directly into play as 3/2 menaces and just tried to like race me. But I had a bunch of removal in my hand because that's the thing my deck is good at.
Yep.
And so I was able to like deal with those. I actually ended up scamming my own Solitude later in that game. So I had a lifelink blocker in case my life total was getting a little bit low, and just to increase the clock. And that game was just all about Doorkeeper Thrall. And I found out later that he had a Cryptic Code in hand, which got shut off by the Doorkeeper Thrall in that game. And then definitely seemed like Doorkeeper Thrall was a problem for him. He definitely like changed his sideboarding plan in game 3. I think he had Well of Forgotten's in for game 3, which I don't think he had in game 2. I think he had 1 Dismember, which would have been his only way to interact with the Doorkeeper Thrall in game 2. And then in game 3, I drew my Graveyard Hate stuff. I played an early Cage. I had 1 or 2 Containment Priests. And I just was able to cast removal spells and never really got the powerful like Reanimate Atraxa part of it. Of the deck, and that is how I need to beat that deck. I really have very few. If they reanimate Atraxa quickly, it's really, really hard for me. And otherwise, I think I line up pretty well. I've been pretty happy with my matchup against like the blue-black scam deck that everybody's been playing for a couple months. It's just when they added the Atraxas to it, it really changed the matchup and made it a lot harder. And so I was really happy my opponent didn't have that sort of draw. It's weird because they have a lot of pivots in that deck, and that's a thing that's super strong about the deck, is that it can pivot so well, and you can just, your opponent's going to side in the Leyline of the Voids, and you're like, okay, I have I have Dothy Voidwalkers and Cryptic Coats or True Name Nemesis, or my opponent wasn't playing the white cards, but Triumph of St. Catherine's and Serenities in the sideboard and stuff like that. And you can just make your opponent's graveyard hate look really bad. But actually, the most powerful thing against my deck is the graveyard stuff, particularly Atraxa stuff. So it kind of puts my opponent in a really awkward situation where their pivot doesn't really work. And I actually think they should be on more of the main deck plan. I don't know how much my opponent was on the main deck plan for game 2 and game 3.
It definitely makes them have to think about what they're doing for the sideboard. I was in my third round, I played against someone who was relatively new to playing Mono Black Scam, and I was like, hey, like, the third game, you didn't even pick up your sideboard, so I knew that you weren't siding in anything against my cages, so I just didn't side them out, and I kept them in. I probably would have you picked up your sideboard, I would have immediately taken out my cages, assuming that you were bringing in a different plan. So, making your opponent just think about what their pivot is on a game 3 is certainly important, and also like just making them kind of figure out, do that mental game for the last game,
Yeah, I sometimes forget to do that kind of thing myself, but just to give your opponent an extra thing to think about. Yeah. But I don't think I was going to side differently based on how my opponent. I had enough things to take out, and I was always going to bring in my cages and my containment priest, because if I ever didn't have those cards in my deck and I got reanimated, it would just be so awkward for me.
Yeah.
But I really felt like I had enough answers, and I didn't really feel like I was going to die to the sort of blue-black mid-range beatdown plan with Dothy Voidwalkers and Cryptic Coats and stuff like that. And that's the game plan I want to force my opponent to play, and it worked out well like that.
Yeah. Well, and here we are in the semifinals against Patrick Owens on Grixis Delver.
Yep, I had a really enjoyable semifinals against him. I actually rewatched this match under a couple hours ago because it was streamed. Well, not streamed. It was recorded by 90s MTG,
right?
Yeah, he just did his review stream of those matches today, and I was in the chat during my match. I think I played pretty poorly in this match. I think my opponent played really well. I
feel like this is a match that you have an upper hand in, right?
Oh yeah,
this is like the deck that you're built to beat, right?
I was extremely excited when I found out what my opponent was on, and in game 1, I put a turn 0 Leyline, and played Scion on turn 3 or turn 4, and made sure it didn't get dazed. And my opponent had 2 cards in hand at the time. And I was just like, if this is forcible blue card, I probably lose this game. And if it's not, I just don't think there's any way I could ever lose this game, because my opponent has no ways to answer Leyline in their main deck. And they had a DRC in play, and the DRC just attacked into my Scion the next turn. And so game 1, I was really happy. I was like, this is the best case scenario. I didn't get to face one of my best matchups all day. And so the fact that I got to face it in the semifinals was awesome. In game 2, we had like a slow start to the game. I think I swords his first 2 creatures. Was at a pretty good life total. My opponent stuck on 2 lands, and on turn 3 or turn 4, on my opponent's end step, I have 3 lands in play, so I guess it was probably turn 3. I have plenty of things to make my land drops. I just screwed up and I cast a Brainstorm. And I just was impatient. I was like, my hand kind of sucks, other than the fact that it makes all its land drops. And my opponent had Bowmaster's Force Will.
No.
And so I just sort of, and my opponent was stuck on land, so it's not like they could ever stop and cast cantrips, because if they ever cast a cantrip and they don't see a land, they're in super hard time, because they're no longer holding up Bowmasters and stuff like that. And if my opponent ever plays out Bowmasters, I get to then respond with my Brainstorm and do that. And so it was just, if I'm making land drops and I want the game to go long, and my opponent's not making their land drops, and I'm at 17 or whatever, there was no reason to ever cast that Brainstorm.
Because that's you're at 17, then you're at 14, and then you're at what, like 8 after that?
Yeah, I was able to find some decent stuff off the Brainstorm, and it was really close. I ended up playing a big Murktide Regent, and I had Endurance and Murktide Regent in play, and I was at 12, I think, or 12, and I had 4 non-basics, and I don't think my opponent ever hit the 3rd land drop in that game, and they went, end of turn, price of progress, you down to 4, untap, Molten Collapse here, Murktide attack you. And it was just like, yeah, I could have played a little bit more conservatively, not chipped in for 3 with the endurance, but I was kind of needed to get the game over with because I was in a lot of danger of price of progress no matter what. And it ended up, my opponent it just lined up super well for my opponent at the end of that game, and I was still feeling super confident going into game 3. And in game 3, I think I cantripped on 1 off a tropical island, and then I cast Leyline Binding on 2, and then on my opponent's turn 2, they wastelanded me. And when they played Wasteland, I was sure they were going to wasteland my Scrubland because I had Scrubland Tropical Island in play. And just the way my hand worked out, I had 2 non-basics in hand. I think I had a Tundra and a Volk in my hand. There was nowhere I wasn't going to fetch basics. This was a game where you fetch non-basics and you say, okay, you need 4 wastelands or whatever. If you draw all 4 of your wastelands, you're going to take me off my mana. But I just overwhelm their wastelands, make them take the tempo hit to wasteland you or whatever. And my opponent wasted the Trop, which was very interesting to me. And usually I am very happy when my opponent goes after my green mana or even my blue mana as opposed to my white mana, because usually when I kind of get tempoed out by especially decks like Delver, I have 2 removal spells in hand and I can only cast 1 a turn because I only have 1 white source, or I have to go get my basic planes after that, and then my Leyline Bindings are a little bit too expensive, and stuff like that. So I was very surprised when my opponent hit my Tropical Island, but I think it's a thing. My opponent saw Endurance in game 2, so they know I have a double green card in my deck. They also have probably seen enough of my deck that they know that 2 of my green sources are tapped because my Triome is green, and so I only have 2 untapped green sources in my deck. And then also I fetch thought a while and then fetched the Trop on turn 1, so they may have had a read that I
might
didn't
be
have.
Off of blue completely, yeah.
Well, I would say more that I fetched Trop over Basic Island on 1, which I did primarily, I think, to cast Leyline Binding on 2. But whatever, that combination of things led my opponent to wastelanding my Trop, and it just really came back to bite me. My hand was like a Beans and an Endurance, and I ended up cantripping and finding my Ketria Triome, and so it was 1 turn slower on then getting the Beans going, and then finding the other stuff. I ended up having to pitch my Endurance to prevent some damage and take away Delirium. And just by the time I kind of got things under me with a Carpet of Flowers and a Beanstalk, I was at a pretty low life total, maybe 5. And I cast a Triumph, and my opponent was able to cantrip, put their Delirium back together and kill my my Triumph of St. Catherine, and then attack me for lethal over a couple turns. And I think there was a point at the end last where I had Solitude, white card. I made mana with my Carpet and hard cast a Solitude, and it got Force of Willed, and that was kind of the end of the game, just sealing the deal. My opponent played really well, was really able to very quickly and efficiently get their Delirium back after I interacted with it, and after they got rid of Delirium to cast a Murktide Regent, and it was extremely well played by them. And I think I screwed up pretty big in game 2, and I always, when I play impatient with the deck, I lose, and when I don't, I win. And I had done a lot of winning that day by not being impatient. So
that's Delver for you too. Sometimes they'll just capitalize,
Yeah.
Well, I mean, again, congratulations, amazing run. Going from losing the first round all the way to only losing the last round.
The person who won the tournament, my semifinals opponent, lost round 1 as well.
Oh, wow. That's insane.
Yeah, and then won 10 in a row. Yeah.
Wow. Well, final question.
Yeah.
Any changes you would make to the deck?
I don't really think so. I wanted to look at the mana base one more time. I understand the hedge maze is probably the thing that I'm most concerned about, in terms of, there were definitely some times where the hedge maze and the triome, like my surveillance and my triome being the same colors, felt awkward, but I don't really know. I really like how the deck was built. I sided out the Murktide a lot, especially because people they had Pyroblasts in postboard to kill my Leylines, and that just is a really good answer to Murktide. So maybe I would consider playing something else over that Murktide, but I think the list was really well built. I was really happy with the sideboard. I would probably just run this list back for now, and there's not too much I would change again. I didn't build the deck, Jarvis, you did, but I was very happy with it, and every decision he explained his decisions in a stream, and I agreed with a lot of them, and it really came together really well.
Cool. Well, Amy, thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure talking to you about this. I mean, do you have any other thoughts on the format that you want to share with us?
Legacy's awesome. I don't get to play it a ton. I mainly just play it at big events every couple months, but I always have a great time, and the people are always so nice and awesome. And it just feels like there's always new stuff happening with like the blue black Scaminator deck is new in the last like month or so, I think. And that's really cool. And there's just a lot of cool cards to play with. And I played different decks in almost every single round of the tournament. And that's just, it's so cool that it can do that in a format that also has all these powerful things going on. So it was really cool. And I really enjoyed playing Legacy.
All right. Well, with that said, thank you everyone for watching, and we'll catch you next time later on.
Thank you.
For the gift that keeps on giving all year round, join our Patreon at patreon.com/eternaldurdles. And hey, check out this playlist we got up here with all of our interviews over the last couple of years. Some great people from the Legacy community, some really great guests.